A 30-year-old Cuba case is suddenly back on the table. U.S. troops are being pulled out of Europe in the middle of a war scare, and Washington is still pretending the Iran conflict is somehow under control. So is this actually a series of separate headlines? Or is it one long story about a government that keeps changing the scenery while keeping the same playbook? Today's rundown pulls together the latest from Cuba, Europe, Iran, Lebanon, Gaza, and even a U.S.-Nigeria operation against ISIS. On paper, these sound unrelated. In practice, they all point in the same direction: pressure, escalation, legal workarounds, and a lot of public messaging designed to make hard power look kitey. And once you compare how the different outlets frame these stories, the gaps get a lot harder to ignore. If this breakdown is useful, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The AP says the Justice Department is preparing to seek an indictment against Raúl Castro, tied to the 1996 shootdown of 2 civilian planes operated by Brothers to the Rescue. That's not a minor legal move. That's the kind of headline that changes the temperature fast. Now, to be fair, the shootdown was a watershed moment. It hardened the embargo, deepened the hostility, and became one of those events that both sides have used ever since to justify the next round of confrontation. But here's what the coverage only partially says out loud. An indictment now is not just about old history. It's about signal making. Trump is already talking about Cuba as a declining country, while AP reports that the administration has been choking off fuel shipments and tightening the economic blockade. In other words, the legal threat and the economic squeeze are moving together. That's not accidental. It looks like a pressure campaign built to force the island into submission or provoke a collapse that can be marketed as inevitability. Some people will say, good, hold the people responsible. Others will say, this is overdue accountability for the attack in 1996. That argument isn't crazy. The part that gets skipped is what happens after the headline. If this turns into another regime change push, who actually pays the price? It won't be the retired officials flying in and out of Miami. It'll be ordinary Cubans dealing with blackouts, shortages, and a tightening blockade. What mainstream coverage usually avoids is the practical question. If Washington really wanted justice, why is the preferred tool always the same mix of sanctions, indictments, and threats? If the goal is deterrence, fine. If the goal is regime change, say that plainly. Pretending the two are different is how this keeps getting dressed up as policy instead of pressure. And there's another layer here. The AP notes that CIA Director John Ratcliffe met with Cuban officials, including Castro's grandson, on a visit to the island. So even while the administration is floating indictments, it's also keeping channels open. That doesn't look like a clean strategy. It looks like the usual Washington split screen, one hand talking, the other hand loading the next round of leverage. The deeper issue is that Cuba is being treated as a domestic political prop, as much as a foreign policy problem. Florida politics matter here. So does the symbolism of hammering a longtime adversary. But if the goal is stability 90 miles from Florida, turning the island into the next pressure project is a risky way to get there. While Cuba is being dragged back into the spotlight, the Pentagon is quietly doing something just as revealing in Europe, canceling deployments to Poland and Germany in order to reduce troop numbers. That detail matters more than the official framing. The administration says this is part of a planned drawdown of about 5,000 troops to Europe. But U.S. officials also told AP that 4,000 troops from an army brigade were no longer heading to Poland, and another deployment to Germany was canceled too. Polish officials rushed to say they weren't being singled out. The Pentagon said the process was thoughtful and not last minute. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle basically said in different language that they felt blindsided. And that's the real story. If you're trying to build deterrence, you do not usually do it by confusing your own allies. You don't make Warsaw and Washington read different versions of the same announcement. You don't let military personnel hear about changes on 20 minutes notice while equipment is already sitting in ports. That doesn't look like strategic clarity. It looks like improvisation with consequences. Now, there is a case to be made for Europe carrying more of its own security burden. Plenty of people have said that for years. It isn't a radical idea. The problem is the way this administration seems to apply it. Loudly, abruptly, and with just enough ambiguity to keep everyone guessing. That might satisfy a domestic audience that wants to hear America first and Europe later. It does not build trust in a military alliance. The timing makes it worse. Russia is still hammering Ukraine. European capitals are already uneasy about U.S. consistency. And now Washington is scaling back rotational deployments while telling everybody not to worry because the U.S. isn't going anywhere. That line may work in a press conference. It doesn't erase the message sent by the trucks, the flights, and the canceled rotations. There's a bigger pattern here too. The administration wants freedom of action in one theater after another, but it also wants to lower the visible cost of maintaining commitments. That creates a contradiction. You can't tell allies the U.S. remains the backbone of deterrence while also treating deployments like they're disposable. And just to widen the lens for a second, the same impulse goes up in the latest ISIS strike in Nigeria. Trump and Hegseth are celebrating the killing of Abu Bilal al-Minuki, described as a top ISIS figure. Maybe the operation did hit a real threat. Maybe it was coordinated well. But notice the pattern. When it's a clean special operation, the administration wants credit for decisive action. When it's a complicated alliance obligation, it wants to minimize the appearance of commitment. One kind of power gets marketed as precision. The other gets trimmed as bureaucracy. That tension tells you a lot about the direction of the foreign policy. It's not retreat exactly. It's selective engagement with a very loud soundtrack. The House just failed to pass a war powers resolution to end the US war against Iran, and the vote ended dead even at 212 to 212. That alone should tell you how politically toxic this has become. 3 Republicans voted to end the war. 1 Democrat voted no. In the Senate, the numbers were just as tight. But the most revealing part is not the vote itself. It's the legal dance around it. The war powers clock expired on May 1st, according to the critics of the war. The administration's answer appears to be part legal argument, part semantic sleight of hand. NBC reported that the Pentagon is even considering renaming the conflict from Operation Epic Fury to Operation Sledgehammer, because a new label could, in theory, reset the clock. That's not statesmanship. That's an accounting trick with missiles attached. Meanwhile, the public is told the fighting has eased or that talks may resume. Iran's foreign minister says Washington has sent messages indicating openness to new negotiations. Trump says he might be open to Iran pausing its civilian nuclear program for 20 years if Tehran shows genuine commitment. On paper, that sounds like diplomacy. In the real world, the blockade is still in place. Iranian ports have been struck, ships are still moving under threat, and the legal and military pressure hasn't gone anywhere. This is where mainstream coverage often softens the edges. A ceasefire gets described like a clean pause. A blockade gets framed like a bargaining chip. Talks get treated like proof that escalation is under control. But the facts on the ground say something different. The war never really left the stage. The Strait of Hormuz is the pressure point everybody is watching. Arauchi warned of more economic consequences for the United States. Iran says commercial shipping is still allowed, but with new protocols. China is signaling it may oppose US-backed moves at the UN. The UAE is fast-tracking pipeline capacity to bypass the strait. Saudi Arabia, according to the separate report, has tried to limit some US options. That's what regional actors do when they see a conflict becoming less about security and more about open-ended leverage. And then there's Lebanon, where the ceasefire keeps getting violated even as it's extended. Israel and Lebanon agreed to a 45-day extension, but Israeli attacks continued anyway. That's important because it shows how the language of diplomacy can coexist with the reality of bombardment. A ceasefire that is violated continuously is not really a ceasefire. It's a pause in the paperwork. The missing piece in a lot of coverage is that these aren't isolated fronts. They're part of one larger regional pattern. Pressure on Iran, pressure on its allies, pressure on shipping lanes, pressure on Congress, and pressure on the public to accept all of it as normal. If you want to understand the human cost of all this, Gaza is where the abstraction breaks apart. Dropsite reports on Mahmoud Khila, the man who's been digging through the remains of his family's home because no propping equipment has been allowed in. He found the remains of 2 relatives, but his wife and children are still missing under the rubble. That's not a metaphor. That is the reality on the ground. People using hammers, shovels, and their bare hands, because the machinery that could help is restricted or absent. The numbers are staggering. Thousands of bodies are still buried. Since the so-called ceasefire, hundreds of Palestinians have been killed. Aid trucks have not come in at the agreed rate. Construction and recovery equipment have been blocked. DNA kits are reportedly restricted too, which means even identifying the dead becomes harder than it should be. That's the part headlines often flatten. We see destruction, but not the longer afterlife of destruction. We see a strike, but not the months spent digging. We see a ceasefire announcement, but not the families trapped between debris and bureaucracy. The violence doesn't end when the cameras move on. It changes form, and then the corporate layer comes into view. Leaked documents show Cisco Systems deepening its relationship with Israeli security institutions, including work tied to military networking, data systems, AI integration, and classified infrastructure. Whatever label a company uses in public, the internal paperwork tells a different story. If your tools help manage strikes, store targeting data, move operational footage, and support defense networks, then you are not standing outside the war. You're part of the machinery that keeps it running. That matters, because modern warfare is often sold as clean and technical. It's not. It's a web of contractors, data platforms, communication systems, and logistics networks wrapped in slogans about innovation and social impact. The public gets the language of progress. The battlefield gets the infrastructure of scale. So when people ask why these wars keep going, the answer is not only ideology or security doctrine. It's also incentives. Governments want leverage. Defense networks want expansion. Contractors want contracts. And civilians in Gaza or anywhere else are left to dig through what remains. The big picture today is pretty clear. First, Cuba is being turned back into a pressure campaign, with an indictment used as both a legal and political weapon. Second, the Europe drawdown shows a White House that wants flexibility more than consistency, even if allies pay the price in uncertainty. Third, the Iran war is still active, no matter how many times it gets renamed, reframed, or described as cooling off. Fourth, Gaza shows the real end state of these policies: rubble, missing families, and a recovery process that is being deliberately slowed. The next few days will tell us whether Washington doubles down on Cuba, keeps playing games with the Iran war clock, or tries to quietly shift the story elsewhere. We'll be watching all of it. If you want more coverage that connects the dots instead of repeating the headlines, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with the story you think the media is underselling the most. And next time, we're going to look at what happens when the legal limits on war stop mattering at all.